Good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Good job. Hopefully nothing catastrophic happened in your work week and you had a great time and you're ready to enjoy the weekend. My name is Brian Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And if you're new to the Food Safety Chat, first off, welcome. We love having you here. This is a live stream we do every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain Time. And we live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. And we answer all things food safety, food security, all those wonderful things that we love doing in our jobs. And one of the things that we do here on the chat is punch in the comments, and we have these up and let us know where you're at. I'm in Loveland, Colorado, and my esteemed guest, Mr. Rod Wheeler with GFDI, is here this morning. How you doing, Rod?
Good morning, Brian. It's always a pleasure to join you from our nation's capital here in Washington, D.C., where we just got rid of the cherry blossoms.
I've never been there to see it in person. Is it awesome, as they say?
It is. It's very awesome. You really, if you don't get a chance to do anything else when you come to D.C., you have to be here, though, within a certain time frame. And usually that's right around March, between March and the middle of April, because after the middle of April, then the cherry blossoms kind of go away. Mm-hmm. But it's a phenomenal time here, and folks come from all over the world. I don't know if you know this, from all over the world just to see these cherry blossoms. It's really phenomenal. So it's a good reason to be in Washington, D.C. I know there's a lot of reasons not to be in Washington, D.C., but this is one of the good reasons to be here.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such a pretty city. Here's a weird little factoid about D.C. that I learned recently. Per capita, Washington, D.C. is the largest consumer of wine in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, isn't that weird?
Yeah,
I guess all the politicians, right?
Think about it. You have Congress here, and I guess half those guys probably drink wine daily. But that's interesting. I would have thought California for some reason.
Yeah, you would. That was a weird one. Wow, fantastic. We got a ton of people here. So, Rod, I think your reputation precedes you because I know this is going to be a great conversation here today. Alexis is here, Claire, Steve, Jordan, Cara, Lance, Joseph. Fantastic. Happy to see you guys. So if you are here and you're not familiar with Rod Wheeler, you're going to love this. I mean, so Rod is one of the leading experts. I know I'm going to embarrass him here, but one of the leading experts in food defense, food security, all these different type of things. And just the stories he can tell relative to what he does. Absolutely amazing. And so with that, I almost did it, Rod. I almost did it. Everybody, please join us for a sip of your favorite beverage and cheers. Wonderful, wonderful. So, good morning. Harabi. Hopefully I said your name correct there. Good evening. So on another part, that's always what's amazing with this chat too, Rod, is people from all over the world tune in for this chat, which is super cool. Pittsburgh, love Pittsburgh. Such a pretty town, Pittsburgh.
And you know what's really good, Brian? I'm glad that folks from all over the world chime in, but it's so much good information week by week when you put on these food safety chats. I mean, you know, if you're in the food industry in any capacity, this is invaluable. I mean, every Friday from 10 to 11 East Coast time. I mean, there's so much good information. I'll tell you, when I'm traveling and I'm not able to join the chat, I always set my DVR or I record it. You know what I mean? Because it's just so much good information, and you have such a variety of guests. So it's always good. So thank you for presenting this, Brian, for the food industry. This is something that we really much need.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Last week was a really fun one. We had Bill Marler on. Yeah. And you can kind of see right back here with my bacteria, right? I got a Salmonella and E. coli sitting back there, and I've got my "Get the F out of FDA" T-shirt from Bill. And so he makes some good points for separating out the different functions within FDA, because as you know as well as I do, if two people are in charge of something, nobody is, because nobody takes responsibility. And the food side of FDA has definitely gotten shortchanged relative to the drug and medical device. So hopefully some traction will happen around that. But as we all know, in the world of Congress and regulations and all these type of things, nothing changes until it does. And then all of a sudden, it changes. So, and that's kind of a good segue, I think, too, into our topic for today. And as we were prepping for this call, you brought to my attention in the Food Safety Tech magazine an article from April 18th which was really, really good. So let's kind of dive into that.
Absolutely. So this was an article that was written by a colleague and a friend of mine, George Gansler. I'm sure many of your attendees are familiar with George. George has been in the food industry for many, many years. He's a director of, let me make sure I get his position right. He's the senior managing director of consulting, training, and technical services for NSF. Mm-hmm. And, for many years that I've known George, and I guess it's been, maybe 18 years, he's always talked about the importance of very good risk-based food safety measures that we have in our facilities. And then, of course, food defense and food fraud. And so when I saw this article, Brian, that he had recently written on April 18th, I said, this is really timely because, and we're going to kind of dissect the article a little bit here, but what's so timely about this is that this is post-COVID, right? This is post-pandemic. And what George obviously has realized, and as well as myself and probably you, is that because of the pandemic and COVID, I think some companies, some food processing companies may have let their guards down, so to speak, because we had so many things to focus on with the health of our employees and things like that. So what George is saying in this article, I think in essence, is that it's time now that we reassess our risk-based assessments that we do at our food facilities.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point because, part of it, right, is the COVID piece of it. And I was kind of thinking about this last night as well. Ukraine. All of these disruptions in our supply chain. Now, all of a sudden, and I didn't know this before the whole Ukraine situation happened, most of the sunflower in the world, sunflower oil, comes from Ukraine. And so now all of a sudden companies were scrambling and they were just trying to find supply. And a lot of the things that we're talking about here today, they weren't even really thinking about. And you have to really worry about those too. So refocusing, I think, is kind of a good way to kind of talk about this then. So do you think that people need to refocus on that risk?
Absolutely.
What do we mean by that?
Sure, absolutely. Refocus on how we are looking at the risk, not only at our facilities, but the entire food supply chain, right? We need to look at it a lot differently. So a couple of points that I pulled out of the article that he had written. And by the way, I actually wrote an article back in 2009, believe it or not. And this was right around the time when FSMA was really just starting to be put together. I wrote an article along with a colleague of mine named Bill Ramsey. Bill Ramsey used to be the director of security. I don't know if you knew Bill, director of security for McCormick Foods.
Oh, wow.
And, McCormick, they get a lot of product from foreign countries, spices and things like that. And so back in 2009, Bill and we had a long discussion about goal-based food defense and goal-based food safety. And so when I saw this article that was written recently by George, it reminded me of that discussion that Bill and I had about goal-based, because what George is saying in this article is that risk in and of itself needs to be evaluated, but not just at the plant level, but the entire food supply chain. I'm saying, what are your goals? So let me just put it like this, just to kind of break it down a little bit for the audience, right? So when I go out to a facility, for example, Brian, to do a site food defense assessment, the first thing I always ask managers before I even do the vulnerability assessment is what? What are your goals? What are the things that you want to achieve or hope to achieve by my visit with this vulnerability assessment? We start talking about the goals. And now, once you set your goals, and this is what George is saying in the article, now you have to look at the risk, the inherent risk that's associated or preventing you from reaching those goals. Now, obviously, our goals are food safety, food defense, food protection, things like that. What can keep you from achieving those goals? If you don't have a good risk assessment done, and if you haven't reevaluated your risk and been flexible enough to what's going on in the world, then you may find yourself behind the 8 ball. And I think that's the point that George is really making with this article.
Oh, interesting. So can you give me some examples to help kind of, put this in concrete terms? What would be some risk assessment examples?
So let's say, for example, the entire supply chain, right? Let's just take food fraud, for example, right? Which is a risk. Food fraud is a huge risk these days for a lot of food companies. We're getting a lot of products from foreign countries and other places. How do we know that product, maintains the standards that we require here in the United States from our FDA or our government agencies? Well, we won't know, and we don't know unless we do what? That risk assessment that George is talking about, looking at the entire chain. Where does that product come from? Where did it come from? Where is it going? Who are the folks behind creating of that product or that ingredient? And then following that throughout the entire supply chain. So we have to look at things like that. We look at other risks, though, which some people may not get, but we look at risks like you talk about Ukraine, and we talk about some of these other instances that's going on around the world where there's unrest, right? We always have to say to ourselves, how could this have an impact on the food supply? Or could it even have an impact on the food supply? Look, this is a 1-hour webinar, but I can tell you that there's been some things going on in the food supply that has made me sit back and say, wait a minute, what's going on? Because, we know that there's risk all around the world. Is someone targeting the food supply? And again, not just with food safety, but even with food defense and food fraud.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that then is a lot of people don't know this. There's a tendency in the US to think that the rest of the world is just like us, right? That's human nature.
Right.
And when you go to a foreign supplier and you say, okay, are you SQF certified or whatever? And they say, oh, absolutely. Here's my certificate. There's a lot of fraud around certificates. There are fake certificates that are created in other countries. And if you just say, oh, okay, cool, here, thanks for the certificate, and you accept it at face value, you're fooling yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? That's another point that George mentioned in this article. He said, what type of risk assessments are we actually doing? Not only what type of assessments are we doing, but what are we doing with that data that we get from conducting these assessments? Are we activating plans, crisis plans, or preventative measures, to deal with whatever we've identified with those risks? And you're 100% correct. I mean, you see a lot of companies that says, well, let's just check the box. So if we can check the box, we're good. We're in compliance. But again, go back to what I was saying earlier about that meeting that I have with managers. At the end of the day, when I do that vulnerability assessment or you do your food safety assessment, what is it? What are the goals? Are the goals just so that we can check the boxes? If that's the case, anybody can check the boxes and say, oh, we do this, we do that, we're safe.
Yeah.
But here's the question you have to ask yourself, Brian, and I always ask my clients this: are you really safe, or are you just checking the boxes? It's a huge difference between the two. So when we talked earlier before we started about penetration tests. You asked me about that, and I was telling you I was going to be doing a number of them soon in the United States here. When you do these penetration tests, they're eye openers. They're eye openers because companies are like, wow, I thought we had plans in place to address these things or to prevent certain things from happening. What the penetration test shows you is that these plans are not effective. So go back to George's article. So what he's saying is, are you just doing risk assessments just so that you can say we've done a risk assessment, or are you really addressing the risk that's present?
Right. Well, I think that's a great example just from the overall standpoint of what we do in food safety and quality assurance and food fraud in these fields is if your validation isn't followed through and you're not then verifying that things are being done correctly, right? We would never dream of putting in an allergen program and not doing testing to make sure that the equipment is clean. So we're making sure that those activities are functioning the way they should. And what you're saying is exactly the same thing. If you're fooling yourself and not verifying that those activities that you've identified through that risk assessment are true and are actually happening the way you think, you're fooling yourself.
Well, you're fooling yourself and you're not going to reach your goals. Yeah. Remember, the goals are safe product, right? And safe people, safe employees, and keeping the consumer safe. One of the other things that I noticed in George's article that I just thought was so interesting, let me just pull it up here. He says that he has information, data has shown that over the past year, recalls in the United States has increased 700%. That's huge. And product recalls, look, if you have enough of those, and I know some of your attendees know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been through recalls with companies. I've assisted them with them. When you have enough of those things, you're going to go out of business because recalls are not cheap. And we've seen a significant number of food safety related recalls over the past couple of years. Why is that? That's because companies have not reevaluated their risk. look, if you evaluate your risk, if you just go by the steps that George outlines in this article, and you take a deeper dive into what risk do we have today. You see, risks are changing. And that's the other thing too. Brian, risk change. You can't just do a risk assessment 2 years ago and say, we're going to use this for the next 10 years. No, risk change. They increase, they decrease. And if you're not flexible with your plans, and if you're not flexible with evaluating your risk, again, you're going to find yourself at the end of the 8 ball. And again, I've seen companies literally go out of business because they failed to evaluate their risk.
Yeah. And part of this, especially on the fraud side of things, is we're working against an intentional adversary, someone who is deliberately trying to find the holes. They don't stop, right? We can't publish a defense plan and then all the criminals go, you know what? I'm gonna get a day job now. I can't. No, they're criminals. They're gonna keep coming at you and figuring out ways. And to your point, things change all the time. Food fraud targets areas where they can make a quick buck. So if all of a sudden sunflower oil, my previous example, becomes unavailable, guess what? Price is going to skyrocket. And all of a sudden those food fraud guys are going, oh, hello. If I take some low grade crappy oil and call it sunflower oil, I'm in business.
Exactly. I mean, here's a good example. Go to the grocery store, right? Look at the cooking oil section. It's funny because I do this quite often. When I go to the grocery store, I'm looking at the variety or the variance of prices amongst the same products. And what I always think to myself is, how come one product in cooking oil, for example, with one ABC company is this price, but with this company, it's almost 70% less, but it says 100% cooking oil. What's that all about? You know what I mean? There shouldn't be that much divergence in pricing.
No, there shouldn't.
Is authentic, but that's just a quick test. When you see things like that, it should automatically raise a red flag. Let me give you one more example. I had a case just last October. As a matter of fact, it was in Texas. I received a photo from a company who said that they received information. This is really interesting, that their product was being shipped over to Rio de Janeiro. Okay. And it was being cut. It was a flour type of product, but it was being cut with some other wood fillers. But it was sold in the bags from this company in Texas. See, that's food fraud. Now, the wood fillers isn't going to kill anyone or harm them, but it's food fraud. You fill up the bags. You know what I mean? It's not authentic product. It's not 100% product. The sad part about it was they used the same packaging from the company in Texas to sell this product over in Rio. See, that's not good. What I did, I reached out to law enforcement, believe it or not, here in the U.S., and I had a buddy of mine with the FBI contact the authorities over in Rio just to make them aware of it. And you know what was startling to me? They were already aware of it. They said, that's somewhat of a common practice over there, which is interesting. Because my question becomes, does that product ever come back to the United States? And if it does, how do we catch it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. The oil example, I was thinking.
I think I lost the audio. Brian, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I can't hear you for some reason.
I'll tell a quick story while you're doing that. Is one of the things that I do as a consumer to evaluate risk in those oil type products is, so I buy a lot of stuff at Costco. I'm a huge Costco person. And can you hear me now, Rod?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, awesome. And so one of the things that I do on the cooking oil side is I'll spend the extra money and buy the Costco extra virgin organic olive oil, because I know Costco's got really good quality systems in place. Now you have the organic checks with auditors going out there. So from my viewpoint, the chances of getting a fraudulent oil is downgraded. And I'm willing to pay a little bit extra for that extra security.
Absolutely. And I think most consumers would be. Look, right now, consumers are just concerned that the products that they purchase are good quality. The good news is here in the United States, and I'm going to have to say because of the companies and because some of the government, but You know, a lot of these companies that I know here in the United States, they really do good work, and they're very passionate about their product being safe. I have to say that because you know these people personally, and so do I. And that's the good news with all of this. And as long as we continue to have passionate quality folks out there, quality assurance folks out there, plant management, I think, you know, we're going to be okay. But we all have to be diligent, and we all have to work together in making sure we can identify any risk that may present itself along the way. Now, having said that, one other thing that I thought was interesting that George wrote in the article is that companies need to stay ahead of emerging legislation. He's 100% correct about that, because legislation is changing as well, and it's changing rapidly. And so companies have to do their due diligence by way of trade organizations and organizations like that, and independent consultants, staying ahead of what's, you know, required by the government, whether it's the government here in the United States or foreign governments. As a matter of fact, you know, I do quite a bit of work up in Canada, and there are certain regulations in Canada that they have that they require food companies that we may not have here in the United States. So I thought when I read that point in George's article, I said, you know what, he's right about that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because the EU, I read recently that they are phasing out fumigants for products, right? So you have like, what is it, like ethylene oxide that's used to treat products like flour and things like this, and that's being removed as an option. And that only allows then steam processing or irradiation, neither of which is, you know, irradiation, forget it, right? Consumers are like, oh my God, you're irradiating my food. And if you put steam on flour, what's going to happen, right? It's going to turn into a giant brick. So that doesn't work. So now a system that was used to enhance the safety of the product with no ill effects, right? This off gases and everything is fine. Now that's no longer an option. So food companies have to scramble. And that's a good way then for criminals and people who are committing food fraud. They don't care, you know, and if they're still using, you know, this methodology then to fumigate and make sure that product is safe, are they going to continue doing that and then undercut the rest of the market? That's a really good example of what are the different stakeholders in this whole process that George talks about. You need to understand that shifting and changing tide within these areas.
Well, you know, you talk about stakeholders, and that's another very, very critical point. You know, companies can't operate in 2023 and going forward. We can't operate in silos. We have to operate our businesses as a community, so to speak, right? It's going to be not just your own individual stakeholders at your facility, but it's your government contacts, it's your trade associations, it's your consultants, it's everybody, and it's the entire food supply chain. That's what's critical here. You know, what happens if I get the product in from ABC company and I'm going to do something to this product and then I'm going to send it to another company? Every company along that chain should be aware of the processes of where that product has been and where that product is going. That's the difference now with FSMA and the Bioterrorism Act, because, you know, the Bioterrorism Act did not really require that, but now with FSMA it does. So no, that was critical about that point that George raised in that article.
Yeah, and on that stakeholder side as well, if you're then going back and investigating your supply chain, let's say you have a broker or a distributor in that supply chain, and they think that they can just send you whatever as long as they meet your pricing. No, you can't, right? So you have to make sure that that broker understands, I am purchasing from this specific company, and I'm purchasing from this exact plant. You can't substitute in other operations, because then I don't know the risk.
Exactly. And there's many risks that are inherent, we've been talking about, within that process and within the supply chain. Again, what's our goal? Our goal is to eliminate the risk. We're not going to always eliminate the risk. That's just not going to happen, but it's to reduce those risks. So, you know, one of the things that I indicated in my article back in 2009, and I pulled this up earlier today, I had created somewhat of a template for companies to use back then. And I'm just going to quickly go through this. So how should this whole thing about evaluating risk work, right? So the first thing you want to do is create your facility or food defense plan. You can call it whatever you want, your food protection plan. You know, back in 2009, you may remember this, there was a lot of talk about combining food safety and food defense into one, which would have been food protection. So let me even take you back a little bit further before 2009. Brian, I don't know if you remember the Food Ag Sector Coordinating Council. It was called the FASCC.
I think
this
so, yeah.
was back in 2004, and I'm dating myself, so don't ask me how old I am. But this was back in 2004. It was the Food Ag Sector Coordinating Council. Now, this was a group that was comprised of 7 to 8 different sectors of the food supply. And this was right after 9/11, and we were all coming together to try to put together a risk-based evaluation for the food sector, for the food supply. And it included a whole number of areas of the food supply. Now, the government had a group as well called the GCC, which was the Government Coordinating Council. And so what eventually happened right around 2006, 2007, the FASCC, which is the Food Ag Sector Coordinating Council, came together with the GCC, and together they started creating, that's when the beginnings of FSMA started to become known. That's just a little good history as to how we got to where we are today. Right now, I don't know if your audience remembers what they used to call ISACs, ISAC, no. Right? And these were groups put together, these information sharing analysis centers. You know, everything in Washington has to have an acronym, first of all. Let's establish it. Right? If it doesn't have an acronym, you can't get it past Congress.
Right.
So, ISAC, Information Sharing Analysis Center. So the ISACs came out of the FASCC and the GCC for the food supply. So we had food industry ISACs all around the country. And from that, we began to create food defense plans, food safety plans. And that was the initial stages of FSMA, right? Wow. This is before FSMA even became FSMA. These were like the workings into creating FSMA. So I created this template back then. And what did these ISACs and the FASCC talk about? We had to identify critical components within our organizations, right? Within the supply chain, the food supply chain. We had to assess the threats and opportunities. Food safety, food defense, food fraud wasn't quite as big back then as it is now. Develop protection measures and mitigation strategies. Identify risk. So these are all the initial things that you do. So let's say you put all this together and now you have a food protection plan, right? So now you have the tampering event, or you have the food fraud event, or you have a food safety event. So because of that plan that you've created, and with that plan that you've created now, it's based on goals. You've identified risk. Once you have that event, certain things should kick in automatically. Why? Because you've anticipated these things when you develop your original food protection plan. So when these things kick in, you assemble your crisis team. Now, we haven't talked much about that, but crisis management for food companies is critical. Underline that. Crisis management for food companies is critical because a number of things can send a food processor into a crisis situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be product tampering. It could be a workplace violence situation that affects the brand. And remember, we're trying to protect the brand as much as we're trying to protect the product, right? So you assemble your crisis team, you monitor your business components that you've already talked about, you contain the impact of whatever the tampering situation is, and then you return to some degree of normalcy. Throughout this entire process, though, you want to be sure that you've identified ahead of time who your stakeholders are, because you want to get all of your stakeholders involved, right? During the time that you try to figure out what happened and what caused it. Again, don't operate your business in a silo. Get as many people involved so that you can work together to try to come up with a reasonable solution. Again, the first step, though, is to create that goal-based, risk-based assessment. What is it that we're trying to protect?
Right. And so, yeah, 2 big points out of this, and the parallels here with how, food safety is managed, exactly the same. So you have this plan in place. And one of the things that, to your point earlier, Rod, companies will create these plans and stuff like that and say, oh, okay, great. Then they put it on a shelf. You got to test it, right? It's like what you were talking about with your penetration activities, right? Going and testing companies to see if what they think is happening is really happening. So getting those groups together and say, okay, let's run through a scenario. And because you understand that risk in your chain, your supply chain within your products and your processes and all these things, you can then go back through that and figure out where the defect occurred and what you can do in the future then to prevent a recurrence. Another important piece of that then too, and companies skip over this as well, is the post-mortem. Companies, when an event happens, want to go, oh my goodness, okay, well, let's get back to normal. No. Let's go back through this and figure out how we can improve the system to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
You're 100% spot on. I like to call that the anniversary of whatever the event was that took place. And I use a number of examples in food defense where when companies have had tampering situations every year after that situation, around that date, they sit down and they talk about how far they've come since that situation has taken place. Let me give your audience just a real quick example that I use on food defense. Back in 2009, Wendy's had a situation on the West Coast where someone had placed a human thumb into a bowl of Wendy's chili, right? Just Google it. It's still on the internet, I'm sure. A human thumb. So this was a big deal. This was a crisis for Wendy's. The reason it became a crisis is because it went viral back in 2009. It was all on the news. And with the news there, they had a simulation of the thing of a Wendy's chili, and they had like a thumb going over into it. And when consumers watch that, they're like, oh, that's gross, right?
Yeah.
Wendy's, their sales nosedive, mainly on the West Coast. This happened, I think, out in San Diego. And so as a result, their sales nosedive because people saw that and said, I'm not going to buy Wendy's chili for a while. Look, I love Wendy's chili. And even when I saw it, I said, I'm going to hold up from buying Wendy's chili for a while. It's just a little gross. You know what I mean? But here's the point. Wendy's learned from that experience. Now, thankfully, they were able to bounce back quickly. But every year, believe it or not, Wendy's still talk, and that was in 2009. They still talk about that incident. How far have they come from learning how to deal with situations like that? And in the crisis management course that I teach, there's about 6 or 7 really good examples similar to that, food related, where companies have bounced back. Why? Because they had plans in place. They had identified potential risks and they knew what their goals were. And so they had tested their plan. You just talked about testing the plan. Look, if you don't test your plan, don't even bother writing it, because I'm going to tell you, and I've been doing this a long time, obviously, if you don't test your plan, it may not work when you anticipate or when you need it to work. One more very quick example. There's a company I've been working with for many, many years. Very good company. They do great work. I wrote their food defense plan years ago, but they test that. They test elements of the plan like every year. But there was one particular element that they tested and they realized it wasn't working properly. And here's what it was. And your audience will find this interesting, Brian. They had a tampering situation. We kind of created it. So they had a tampering of their product. But what was happening was, this was about 3-4 years ago, they started sending emails around to each other about what was going on. One of the emails leaked out to the media. See, they hadn't thought about that part of it. So what measures should you have in place to prevent that from happening? And so we had it all set up during the test whereby we had someone act as though they were the media. Fox and CNN is in the lobby with their cameras. They got wind of something happening at this company's products. Now they're testing their plan and they say, we got to find ways to plug those holes, so to speak, so that can't happen. And we did put in measures. Now, they don't send as many emails. Matter of fact, during the crisis, all your company emails should go through one particular person, not to each other. It should go all through one person. That one person that they go through is someone that's being supervised by the corporate legal attorney, by your company's attorney. There's a reason for that, good reason for it. We can't get into it today because we don't have time, but think about those things if you're writing your crisis plan. Certain things need to be in place.
Right, exactly. And that's why you need to practice, because if people don't understand that, right, they're sending text messages and they're on Slack and everything else saying, oh my God, and all these type of things, that's all discoverable, right? To your point, we don't have a whole lot of time to dig into that, but yeah, you need to practice. And as I've worked in quality assurance in larger companies, we had communications departments, and it was their job in those crisis situations to coordinate and manage the activity around this, because, and this is a great point that George makes in the article as well, the expectations of our consumers of our products have changed on how we manage this and what we expect. Because, going back to that Wendy's example, that was a while ago. Just think how much the methods of communication have changed in the last 10 years. Twitter, all these things, holy moly.
And you know what? There's so many new scams, and maybe a few months from now, we'll have another webinar podcast and we'll talk about these new emerging scams, even in the food industry that just happened recently. And companies need to know about these things because they're pretty creative. But the reason they're creative is because technology and things change, risks change. You know, one of the tests that I do for a number of companies is ransomware exams, right? We'll put together a ransomware test. So what if X, Y, and Z occurs? Your computer starts shutting down. All of a sudden you get this email saying, pay us $100,000 or else, that kind of thing. You know, has companies actually gone through that test, physically gone through it and identified the risk that's involved with that? Unfortunately, not enough companies has. And so as a result, there's some companies, even as I speak, that's going through the process, working with government agencies of trying to figure out who, you know, shut down their systems or was able to hack into their systems. That's a big deal these days. Again, you have to test the whatever it is that you've created. But again, go back to our initial discussion. Step one is creating the goals. What are the goals that we're trying to achieve? Going back to George's article, let's identify the risk that could prevent us from reaching our goals. And once you identify those risks, you start implementing mitigation strategies. What you'll find is that your company will operate a lot more efficiently.
Absolutely. And what about, I mean, this was interesting too. What about climate and other environmental concerns as part of that risk factor?
Absolutely. You don't want to just limit it to just crime or terrorism or anything like that. You got to consider everything. The environment, as you just talked about, weather changes, anything that could impact your business or the supply chain, anything. And you always want to consider all of those things and reach out to the experts. If you don't have the expertise on staff, you know, here in the United States and around the world, NSF, for example, organization around the world, they have experts that can assist companies, you know, try to figure out what are the inherent risks with some of these things. Let me give you one more example. Over in Nicaragua, for example, they have a lot of earthquakes and things like that. Now, there's some food production, a number of food production companies over there that ship product to the United States. They are working with some of these global organizations such as NSF and maybe AIB and those kind of folks because they are worldwide. They are global companies. So they have experts in these areas. Again, we talk about stakeholders. These are people that you can bring in that can assist you create the necessary plans to try to reduce your risk.
Yeah, so great example. Here's one that just kind of popped into my head as well. Is earlier this year, right, we had this devastating earthquake in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And a lot of food comes from Turkey. Yeah. If your supply chain includes Turkey and your suppliers were damaged and things like this, has their ability to produce that product been compromised? Are there systems in place, the infrastructure? Do you need to put in additional safety measures in reaction to that?
That's right. And the answer is yes to every one of those questions, because if you don't, just think about the impact that that's going to have on your company. Now, real quick, some people may be saying, well, what's the difference then between your crisis response plan and your contingency plan? There is a difference, right, between the two. Your crisis plan is more reactive to when the crisis occurs. Your contingency plan is really proactive. If X, Y, and Z occurs, these are the measures we have in place that's going to keep our business functioning. So that's the difference between the contingency plan and the crisis plan. I get that question quite a bit. Aren't they the same? No, they're not the same. Remember, the crisis plan is when the plane crashes, this is what we do. The contingency plan is we're going to try to prevent the plane from crashing first. But if it does crash, we have these steps in place that can mitigate the risk.
Wow, I love that example. That's a great one, right? So really what we're talking about, right, is corrective actions versus preventive action.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about. So do we wait, though? And this is a good question for the audience. Do we wait until something happens before we decide what are we going to do about it? Or do we put the plans in place now, as George talked about? Do we identify those things that could cause our company, you know, to experience some kind of a negative impact? Do we identify those risks now, and then we put the plans in place so that if something does happen, we'll be better prepared to deal with it? And I think that's the spirit of George Gansler's article.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of getting these groups together and doing what if scenarios. So another one is these are weird things. I mean, so if you're buying from areas of the world that have, they're a lot rainier or things like this from where you normally purchase things, and you're buying grain products, you may need to do additional testing for mycotoxins because mold is growing on those crops. And it may not be something that you would test in the US, but it's something you need to be looking at in your overseas marketplace. And then on the fraud side of things as well, too, if they are having those particular issues, what's being substituted in, right?
Exactly. And we go back to my example about Rio, the same thing.
Yeah.
What are they substituting, to create that product, to create that finished product? And how would you as an organization know it? How would your company know that they are? And I know some people will say, well, we do testing. And I get this one a lot too. We require certificate of analysis, right? We hear that all the time. Now, folks, be careful with that. Don't think that certificate of analysis is the Bible. Trust me, it's not. You know what I mean? I can give you example where people were surprised to find out what was really in their product versus what that COA said was in the product. So, the certificate of analysis is fine, but don't let that be the end all. Have your own measures in place whereby you can verify. You talked about verification, Brian, that you can verify that this is exactly what it's supposed to be, regardless of what the the certificate of analysis says, because you're going to always get the certificate of analysis.
Yeah, we can all sit at our computer right now and create one, right? It's not that hard. And the example for that comes to mind as well is when criminals figure out on this fraud area something that works, oh man, they're off to the races. Melamine, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, let's put this chemical byproduct that we've got laying around that's worthless that mimics protein testing.
Yeah.
Bam.
You remember that with the dairy industry years ago? Remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Over in China.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that happened? And I think 11 people, mainly babies, I think in the United States, died as a result of too much melanine in their bodies.
Exactly. And it messes with people's kidneys.
Yeah, you have to really test for things like that.
Exactly. And it's not something, even if you had a COA, right, you're looking at moisture and fat and ash and maybe salmonella or things like that. You're not looking for melamine yet. But at the time, everybody was like, mela what? And then you had to go back and figure out what the heck was going on. And that's a good example then of that reactionary approach. But part of this is you can't cover for everything. So you have to figure out, and this gets back to what George is talking about too. This is risk-based. And that was one of the things early on with HACCP and FSMA, especially HACCP. Mm-hmm. Everything became a critical control point because people would look at it and say, oh, well, it's here, so it must be critical. So we have to always have that in line. And everybody shut down, right? Because you couldn't manufacture because there was deviations every day from these overblown, unwieldy programs that people had put in place. So I think that's a good lesson that George talks about in here too, is it has to be relevant to what you're looking for and what are those risks. So for example, you were talking about earlier, Rod, is if you get that key piece of information from Brazil where the local officials are like, what you gonna do? Oh, okay, well that means I've got to take some mitigating steps on my side because that government in that country has other things that they're worried about and I'm not one of them.
Sure, you're exactly right, but it's your product. The killer part is it's your product's name on that packaging. Yeah. And I'm telling you, let that get out. They sent us pictures with that particular case. It was amazing. I literally looked at the pictures of this product being mixed with wood fillers. It was like a powder with actual flour that supposedly was sold here in the United States out of Texas. That was food fraud all the way there. And, if you don't react to those kind of things, at the end of the day, it's going to definitely impact your overall business. And like I said, I've seen it where some companies have gone out of business because they failed to recognize the warning signs. Now, let's shift into the warning signs. What are some warning signs? What are some things that you need to be looking for? We become creatures of habit. Oh, let's check this box. Let's check that box. Let's look at the COA. We're good. No. One of the things George mentioned in this article is that you have to sometimes think outside of the box. It's not going to be in plain black and white, folks. And those of you all that's attended my food defense class knows I do this all the time. I think outside of the box. Yeah, we can check the boxes for FSMA and for the IA rule and all that, and food safety. We got this, we got that. But what happens if that bad guy walks in, going to what you said earlier, Brian, sees that opportunity and says, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to do something nefarious. Now what do you do? Because that wasn't on that checkbox that you know what I mean, that check sheet that you just had. That's why you have to think out of the box. When I know in our last webinar, our last podcast, I told you that I start vulnerability assessments at 2 a.m. Remember, I told you at 2 a.m. in the morning is when I start my vulnerability assessment. People always say, why do you start your vulnerability assessment at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night? I said, because that's when criminals are out. That's when criminals, first of all, they don't get out of bed till 12 noon. Okay. Terrorists don't get out of bed till 12 noon either. It's the truth.
Yeah.
Ask any cop, they'll tell you it's the truth. So crime increases at night and overnight. So we look for the vulnerabilities in the middle of the night. If I'm the bad guy and I'm going to do something to your product, your facility, I'm going to try to get in there at 2 and 3 a.m. Yeah. So we need to look at what vulnerabilities we have in. This is just an example, Brian, of thinking outside of the box. Because, you know, the government, FSMA, or whether you're in Canada or one of these other companies, they can't be that specific. But what George is saying in this article is we can use what they recommend as a guide, and we have to use it for regulatory purposes. But at the same time, we have to expand our knowledge and be realistic about a lot of things. One presentation that I gave a few years ago was titled Regulation versus Reality. That was the title of my presentation, Regulation versus Reality. Yes, we have regulation, but what is the reality? You know what I mean? At 4:00 p.m., when everybody leaves now and nobody's there but your second shift, what's the reality then when that person wants to get in and do something wrong or maybe even adulterate your food product? Yeah. One more real quick example to this. You were talking about production lines and things like that in food facilities, and you talked about critical control points. And some of your audience may chuckle at this, but when I do vulnerability assessments, I always talk about the process flow diagram. I think I talked about that on one of your chats before, and how I use the process flow diagram when I do the vulnerability assessment, because I want to see where your critical control points are in your process, right? Yeah. One question that I always ask managers, Brian, is, do you have cameras facing your critical control points? Now, most managers will say, yes, we do. And we monitor, first thing they'll say is we monitor for temperature. We do those kind of things. But then I turn around and say, now, do you have cameras facing your critical control points for intentional contamination? And they say, well, not really. We only monitor it for food safety-based reasons, but not so much for intentional contamination. And then they start thinking, you know what, that does make sense to put maybe a bigger camera back so that you can see who's going around that critical control point. Because if I'm the bad guy, the best place to put that contaminant in the product is probably at or right beyond the critical control point. And you know what? That's like a aha. I never thought of that. I hear this all the time. I never thought of that. Well, that's okay. You know what I mean? That's what George is talking about when he says think outside the box, right? Yes, we do have regulations we have to comply with, but expand on them.
Yeah, and so as we were thinking about this, and Don was asking in here, Rod, if you remembered a Natalie in the comment section over here. So think of like where concentrations of criminals are. So like prison, right? So these guys are locked up in prison for bad behavior. And think about all the contraband in prison, all the things that they find. You'll see these videos, right, of homemade knives and drugs and all these things get into prison. How does that happen? Guards, right? So if they're guards that are on the take, you know, we've all seen these things on TV shows. I saw a story recently, Rod, where drones were dropping stuff into prison yards, flying over and dropping contraband into the prisoners. Take that information and look at that and say, if they're doing that with drones in prisons, is there some way that they could potentially use drones to impact my product? Who knows, right? Sure. If you don't ask the question, you're never going to know. And what is the risk associated with that? Criminals are creative.
They're very creative, Brian. I think you've been around me too long. but they're starting to think like a criminal, which is always
well, we have to, right? We have to, yeah.
Like the criminal. If you think like the bad guy, you'll stop the bad guy, whether it's food safety or whether it's food defense or food fraud. If you wanted to cause harm to a company, think what they would do. Again, going back to what you just said. I'm just looking at one of the comments. Someone said they took one of my courses in the 90s and they still remember some of the stories. You don't make me seem that old, all right? But you're exactly right, Brian. And we chuckle about this a little bit, but this is really a serious topic. And again, I got to give kudos to George because I thought this article was really, really timely. And the reason, and I know we're just about running out of time, but after COVID, we've seen so many different things start popping up now. We are, and maybe on another podcast we can talk a little bit more about these things. Obviously, I'm focused primarily on the food supply, and we're seeing some things that's making us a little bit nervous. And I just think that all of us in the food industry have a duty and an obligation to one another to share information with each other about things. I got a call from a company recently. It was a dairy company, and they were concerned about fires at food plants. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's been an increase in small fires around the country at food plants. Now, not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but let's start looking at this. Why are there so many small fires occurring at food facilities more than ever before? I don't know, but it's something you want to look at. But when I got that call, I thought to myself, this is how we share information with one another.
Right. Well, and part of this too is can we eliminate all risk? I mean, can we build the perfect plan that eliminates everything, Rod?
No, we can't. We'll never be able to do that. But we have to be diligent and vigilant. And we have to try to stay one step ahead of the bad guy, whether it's for food fraud, food safety, ensuring that the products that we make and create are safe. And again, I give kudos to everyone in the food industry because they work very hard, they work very diligent, and they're very passionate about their food supply being safe. But we have to keep it up because I'll tell you, Brian, when we become complacent, unfortunately, that's when planes fly into buildings, and that's when things happen when we become complacent. We can't become complacent. Now more than ever, again, according to George's article, now more than ever, we have to be vigilant. And we have to think outside the box, and we have to look at our risk, the risk that's right before us, but then we have to think about the risk that may not be right before us. What could potentially happen? Continue to ask ourselves, what if, and what plans do we have in place if X, Y, and Z were to occur so that we can mitigate that risk now and better respond to it if we have to. And then don't forget about learning from our mistakes or learning from the things that has happened. Going back to the Wendy's example, think about what has happened. Where have we been? Where are we now? And where are we going as an as an industry, as a food industry?
Right. And that's a great point too, and you talked about this earlier in our chat today, Rod, is don't be siloed, right? Don't think that, okay, I'm going to write this plan and then that's it. No, right. Everybody in the organization needs to understand that. So we talked about plant contingencies and these type of things, and also corporate as well. So think how important it is for the procurement team to understand what we're talking about today. And they need, to your point, with the oils, if that procurement guy is out there looking for products and they find, this really screaming hot deal on an ingredient for your product, why?
Exactly.
Right.
That's a red flag. And, I'm chuckling because we really need a couple more hours to talk about this. But I mean, we could go on and on and on about examples, such as the one you just gave with the procurement team. I talked about different scams going on. And actually, the scam I was thinking about is something that happened recently with a procurement individual for a company. And I'm getting more information about it now, but I can see this is becoming a big, big deal with the food industry. Now, thankfully, they were able to identify the scam that was going on. It was a produce company, and someone reached out to their AP department. It was just a huge scam, but it was kind of creative. the way the person did it, and they almost got away with about $300,000.
Wow.
So, it's got to keep happening. But again, what do we do about it? Do we just stand by and pray and hope it doesn't happen to us? Or do we do what you're saying and what George is saying, what a lot of us are saying, put the plans in place and let's, work with each other, share information. We got to share information with each other when we learn things that's going on, such as these scams that's going on or food fraud. John Spink is a good friend of mine. He talks a lot about food fraud. And I can't begin to tell you the amount of clients I have that has asked me about food fraud, and I'll immediately direct them to the expert, John Spink, because this is his thing. This is what he does. You know what I mean? And that's what we have to do as an industry, specifically with the food industry. And I can tell you that the other critical infrastructures do the same thing. I mean, they do, whether it's wireless, whether it's airlines, they meet oftentimes collectively as a group and talk about ways that they can better improve and reduce the risk within their infrastructure.
Absolutely. So great points around experts, right? Don't utilize people like Rod to help you with these type of things, right? He knows these things inside and out. So if you're somebody on the chat who's listening to us talking here today, Rod, this is just an avalanche of information. Where should they start?
Well, the first place I would say is to get together with your team members at your facility. Sit down, come up with a plan, start thinking to yourself, what are our goals? What is it that we're trying to protect? And what are the risks that could be involved? Have someone come out and do a risk assessment for you, whether it's on the food safety side, the food defense side, or a food fraud risk assessment. All of these things are available today. And the thing is too, Brian, they don't have to cost you an arm and a leg, because I do hear that a lot too. Companies be like, oh, it's going to cost us a lot of money. No, it doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. There's things you can implement right now that won't cost a lot of money, but you know what it'll do? It'll ramp up your security and the safety of your product. So I think that's a good place to start. Always, you can reach out to folks such as myself. You can go to my website, which is myfooddefense.com. That's myfooddefense.com. But you can also reach out to NSF, because I do quite a bit of work with NSF, and they're a global organization, and they would be more than willing to help any company that needs guidance and things like that. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is this: if you really think you have a situation going on that you're concerned about, and I've been saying this for years, Brian, don't worry about what it's going to cost. Call me, because let's get the bad guy behind bars if we have to. Then we'll worry about how much the hamburger is going to cost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that's what it's all about. And I think that's how we defeat the bad guys in this country and around the world, whether you're in Canada, Brazil, or anywhere. This is how we do it: by sticking together, by working together, and by sharing information, and by watching chats like this one every Friday. And I'm not just saying that as an advertisement, folks. It really matters. It's mattered to me, because there's things on the food safety side that I have learned from just watching these chats, and I've said, oh, wow, this is so interesting. Things I didn't know. I think I know it all, but you'd be amazed. And I just can't believe that this volume of information that you have every Friday is free for anybody just to listen and learn. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I really mean that from the heart, right? It's really phenomenal what I learned from the guests that you have coming on here. It's really helping. I think it's helping change the world.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Rod. And having you on here is always a pleasure. And it's all these perspectives. And like we were talking about with Dr. Spink. And so Dr. DeFeo is on here, who was a guest recently. So good to see him on here. We all have these deep areas of expertise, right? We can't be an expert in everything. Nobody can, right? That's why we have experts and we have resources. And that's why we say on this chat all the time, food safety is not a point of competition. And that applies to all these other topics as well. Food fraud, food defense, all these things. We're all working on these things together, and we're much more effective doing that way. And we're saving ourselves a lot of time too, because if we're trying to reinvent the wheel time and time again, odds are you're going to learn from your mistakes. And that's a costly way to do things.
Absolutely.
You don't want to do that. So
don't wait until the plane crashes. Don't wait until the plane crashes to decide what we're going to do about it. That's not the time.
Exactly. And even little things, right? So an example for me is computer fraud in IT, right? And so we all work with companies and things who are constantly updating these new techniques, right? So we get these text messages now, right? It's like, hey, I'm the CEO and I need you to quick buy some gift cards for me and send. Yeah, right. But people fall for that, right?
You do.
It's getting that information out there. And so thank you very much, Rod, and everything that you do within your company as well. So
sure.
With that, and thanks to George Gansner for the excellent article in Food Safety Tech. So that was published on April 18th. Go out there and read it. I put the link in here from beginning as well. Start having these conversations in your company and revisit and revise constantly. So with that, again, everybody, thank you. Thank you for being here. These chats are so much fun, and it just makes it, as Rod said, right, we're here for you, and this is the highlight of my week. I love doing this every week, and I'm glad that we can do this. So join us next week at the same time. So Friday at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. East Coast, where Rod is in beautiful Washington, D.C., right. And we'll bring on another expert like Rod for another food safety chat. So thanks again, everybody. Have a fantastic weekend. Enjoy yourself. Spring is here. Enjoy. So thanks again, Rod. We'll talk to everybody later.
Stay safe.
Bye.